I'd like to call the meeting of the Ann Arbor Environmental Commission on January 25th to order at 7:01. Matt, will you please call roll?
I will. Commissioner Graham.
He is here.
Commissioner Hutton.
Here.
Commissioner Skinner.
Here.
Commissioner Needham. Commissioner Morocco. Commissioner Slavic.
Here.
Commissioner Mursky.
Here.
Commissioner Hanna.
Here.
Commissioner Apple. Commissioner Gibb Randall.
Here.
Councilperson Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Rigo.
Here.
Councilperson Bannister. You have a quorum.
Okay, excellent. We have a draft of tonight's agenda. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda? Commissioners?
Yeah, I would like to add something underneath new business, if we could. After the policy agenda discussion, I would like to add an item on there, discussion of appointing a solid waste plan steering subcommittee.
All right.
And when we get to that point, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I'm hoping we can accomplish with this subcommittee.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
Point that you
Commissioner
and I
Mursky?
discussed about sustainability wins and challenges / disappointments.
Can we wrap that? Can we just tie that in with the metrics?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
great.
what I noted.
Perfect. Hey, Mike. Any other additions, corrections? All right, is there a motion to approve the agenda as amended? Commissioner Smith, second. Commissioner Gibb Randall, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The agenda is approved as amended. We also have a draft of the minutes from our December 7th meeting. Are there any corrections or questions about the meeting notes? Is there a motion to approve the December minutes? Commissioner Skinner?
Second.
Commissioner Mursky? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The December minutes stand approved as distributed. Would anyone here tonight like to offer public comment?
Hi, David Deepice. I was really happy when I looked at tonight's agenda to see some of these very important agenda items on them, particularly the water presentation. As some of you probably know, the city has just finished a cost of service study on water and sewer. Some of the, if the recommendations of the consultants go through, your single-family owners will see substantial increases, and multifamily owners will see substantial decreases. So I think it's incredibly timely that they're making a presentation tonight, and the Environmental Commission has sponsored the forum. I'm also looking forward to the discussion about the metrics that you guys are going to have tonight. You know, Ann Arbor has had a lot of terrific ideas in the past, but sometimes I have felt that we don't always know what we're looking for in terms of success and how to measure that success. So I'm glad you guys are moving forward in that direction as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right. We have a presentation tonight from the Ford School about water rates. Could you please come?
So I'll do a little introduction. So full disclosure, I'm a graduate of what became the Ford School. And so continue to talk to faculty. And I think what's interesting is over time, there's typically the Ford Schools had a lot of focus on Washington, D.C. People go there to help run the federal government. And there's a growing interest in cities. And so with this is a team from Liz Gerber's applied policy class. And so we got talking about what potential projects might be, and with the water rate study, it seemed like this might align nicely with their interests and the city. So they've gone a little bit beyond what just the rate setting process can do, and I thought it'd be worth this group, especially with the broad sustainability interest and the discussion about equity and how we're taking care of our more vulnerable folks in the community, that this would add some value. So really appreciate the work you guys did, especially since the project's done and this isn't counting towards their grade.
Oh, really, thank you.
But really glad you're here and appreciate the work that you did. So if you could introduce yourselves.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And thank you, commissioners. We're excited to be here. As Matt said, we're a team from the Ford School. We have a group of 5. I'm Jonathan Beam. second year, and here joining me is Angelica de Jesus and Mariah Van Erman. Two team members could not be here this evening, Preston Parrish and Augusta Gudeman. We got started with this project basically to work alongside the rate structure process with Stantec and with the cost of service study. And we approached it from a slightly different standpoint, and that was mainly with the framing that we think that Ann Arbor can and should be a leader in equitable and affordable water distribution. We're gonna go through this pretty quickly because we were hoping to open it up to questions, to get your thoughts, but a lot of our focus was on looking at what other cities are doing. Obviously not just from rate structures, but how we can make water more affordable. Particularly a lot of the structures around growing families, multi-generation housing, and some issues that we think the current rate structure currently is missing. So we really are looking at equity issues beyond the rate structure. We looked at a lot of the data that came out of the cost of service study. Obviously that was a huge help to us, and hopefully will continue to be a source that people can use to come up with better policy recommendations. We looked at case studies with peer cities to look at what they're doing, what is Ann Arbor missing, what are some things that would be easy and affordable to adapt, and what are some things that might take a little longer. And Angelica and Preston in particular did some really great in-depth interviews with lower income residents and some organizations that are working on these issues. Part of our framing was basically that with the cost of service study, with Stantec, with the additions, renovations, modernization of the capital stock, you know, we're not really at a point where revenue is a problem for the system as far as it's at least stable. And a lot of the things at Stantec and that are coming out of that the study are dealing with issues of affordability and how it depends on house size. And we really are trying to say, what's next? What are the equity issues that we're missing? So I'm gonna let Mariah take over here and go through our recommendations.
And while you transfer, can you just tell people who Stantec is?
Oh, sure, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Stantec is engineering and environmental firm that was
They were
contracted
contracted
with
to do the cost of service study, and so through the water system, they won the contract, and I can tell you I was incredibly impressed
They
by
were
the
great.
work that they did. That's right. Commissioner Hutton and Commissioner Graham both participated, but yeah, that's who Stantec is.
Thanks.
Thank you all. So in addition to Stantec's analysis, which is fairly technical, we're looking at beyond the rate structure. Our first recommendation does emphasize what Stantec has found. So this is the multifamily rate, so addressing large buildings and the disproportionate cost that it currently exists for many families in the same building. So this is the new rate structure proposed by Stantec. It still doesn't address the large low-income families in single-family homes, and so for this reason, we're looking at beyond the rate options, which leads us to recommendation number 2. So monthly billing is something that we understand it does increase the administrative burden and overhead costs for cities. Although we have seen that many cities are moving in this direction. So actually, American Water Works has determined that the 10 largest cities are all on monthly billing. And we found that this is because more frequent billing means that bills are lower for low-income households, and then they are able to adjust their payment a little bit more accordingly to their budget, especially for fixed income folks. And a large bill every 3 months significantly disrupts budgeting for day-to-day needs. We also see that monthly billing allows for leaks to be caught quicker. Customers don't need to be surprised when a monumental bill arrives after a few months. And then if something's going on, they have more ability to inquire about solutions. So one alternative to a strict monthly billing is the option for residents to pay a quarterly bill with 3 even installments. And that's something that we've seen, again, in many other cities and feasible through some of their practices. Our third recommendation leads us to assistance programs. So this is really another the main way we're looking at beyond the rate structure and options. So we just want to emphasize that even though there isn't a particularly high rate of non-payment for Ann Arbor's water, a significant number of people still face affordability problems, although it may not be able to be documented or found easily in some other metrics. And this burden is disproportionately distributed among low-income people. So 3 reasons we believe that assistance programs could create a more equitable water program is because they are low-cost solutions for cities. The equitable strategies are not expensive, and they can be even funded with non-rate revenue sources, which, as we know, is important when we're looking at other legal parameters, such as BOLT. Assistance programs are compatible within the state of Michigan because we see them in several cities, including Detroit and Grand Rapids, which I believe that you all have a copy of our full report, and we go into detail about some of the legal parameters and the cities in Michigan who are able to do that successfully. And finally, assistance programs can improve the city's relationship with low-income residents, many of whom, and other residents who care about equity. So moving on to number.
May I just jump in? Could you just explain a little bit about BOLT and what the legal parameters are briefly?
Sure. So as I understand it, I'm not an expert on BOLT, but there are certain legal parameters about how subsidies or payment works across cities. So high income, so payment must be according to usage rather than the general division of payment across associated with income level, if that makes sense. I know Matt has more.
Yeah, just quick, BOLT is a court case, and so communities have been sued if they claim that something is a utility when it's really a tax. And so you're not allowed to hide a tax as a utility. So if you create a stormwater utility and you just charge everyone $25 a parcel, it's not really a utility. Utility is something you use more or less of. So with respect to this group's work, you can't just say, oh, you're poor, we're going to charge you less to use water, because then somebody else is subsidizing them, and that is not allowed legally. So we have some constraints about how we can help vulnerable, poor folks in the community just through the typical rate structure. Does that help?
Yes.
Thanks.
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
No, thank you. So this is also just to emphasize that Barrier Busters is the current existing version of an assistance program for Washtenaw County and the city of Ann Arbor. So this is just another recommendation to expand and bolster this existing opportunity for residents to receive some relief. And then we also have several different types of assistance programs we would recommend looking into, the 3 of which are flexible terms. So this is some type of either forgiveness or some type of deferment in payment. Water efficiency and conservation kits. So these are direct access resources provided to low-income families, low flow shower heads, different toilets and other things to prevent a disproportionate usage among low-income people. And finally, bill discounts. So some cities do find that they can look at other eligibility for federal programs and find a way as a proxy for income. I think that there are ways within the Michigan context to apply those. And for example, Grand Rapids and Detroit have both found ways to do that. All right, our 4th recommendation is administrative partnerships. Various cities and communities partner with existing organizations who administer eligibility qualifications, approval, communications, and other tasks. 2 cities who are doing this really well and notably are Philadelphia and Bloomington, Indiana. To expand on this, the city should integrate water assistance programs more closely with these social service providers. Barrier Busters has partnership elements to it, and there are ways to expand that. So these partnerships utilize community organizations who already do similar communications and reduce the internal cost of spreading the word and other administrative elements. So good candidates for partner organizations have strong community ties through social services. Such organizations that might apply here are Community Action Network and then the United Way of Washtenaw County. And it's key here to play on the trust that they have within community members and make sure that they're bolstering the options available to them. Okay, so moving on to recommendation 5. This is more about reaching out and making aware the options and the opportunities for residents to receive some relief in their larger burden of water bills and utilities. Effective customer relations, communication, and outreach are vital components of addressing current affordability issues and operationalizing equity principles in water systems. So developing strong community strategies is a core element to a healthy business practice that is focused on proactive rather than reactive solutions. So this could be to make bill amounts and usage information transparent and accessible through mobile bill pay and real-time usage data. Use customer account data to target communication towards the most vulnerable customers about options for them, and then communicate the benefits of paying through an online portal, which can also help with some of the administrative costs for the city. So that brings us to our final thank you. We just want to thank everybody who's contributed to our project and supporting us along the way. We thank you for your time this evening, and we're available for questions, and we can also elaborate on some of our qualitative research in terms of hearing firsthand from some low-income residents here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there questions?
Yes.
Mr. Mirsky?
I guess maybe directed to commissioners and Councilman Smith. The recommendations make a lot of sense to me. How do we advocate for those that we think make the most sense? Pass a resolution? What options do we have?
I know we have the resolution option. Are there other mechanisms that make sense?
Well, being that we haven't looked at this study as part of the budget, like I would think that this time that we would have as the Environmental Commission to provide our recommendations to council would be, between February and March, to communicate where we are in some of these. I mean, I had some questions. Like, I agree with you, John, that a lot of these make sense. I'm curious about, not only kind of administrative costs that we have, like, are we talking about a 10% administrative increase if we go to monthly billing? Like, I just want to know what that is so that we understand that parameter, and that's the first question that's going to be asked anyway. But as we look at a lot of these things, there are a couple of other, kind of process-related questions that I believe everybody will have that I would like us to kind of have sorted out before we would come up with a recommendation. I mean, one of the things, and this is a question that I'd ask you guys, is we're a little bit balkanized in the way that we handle some of these things. We're talking about a City of Ann Arbor department and function in water, yet we subcontract to the county to administer all of our social service programs. And, there is undoubtedly a hiccup in, crossing those boundaries. And what is our level of support for that versus, county dollars, other outside dollars? Like, I think those are all questions that council is going to want to ask. I think we've been having the discussion about equity in less specific terms for 2 years. Not really, nobody had a grasp on dollars, ultimately, like what it is. I think having work like this and having Stantec's final report will give us, at least a starting point for how do we develop these programs. I mean, I think that a lot of these things are really basic, and I think that challenging, the city administration to do things like offer, no fee online payment portals, you know, real-time usage data, develop an app that, you know, I can't believe I'm going to say this publicly, but is a lot like what DTE has done with some of their energy usage stuff. Like, all of this makes complete, total sense, and we should do it because if people can track their usage, they're going to use less. And I think, you know, we need to have all of this information in front of council at the same time. And that's as we adopt these rates in the spring.
So what is the best role for the commission to play in that process?
I think to formulate very kind of specific recommendations as much as possible. I mean, I think to take some of the information, like, you know, we understand that the cost is this to go to monthly billing cycle. We, you know, based on our goals of equity and decreasing water use and increasing conservation, we think that this is a good strategy. But, you know, to have, as John would say, some metrics for accountability with that so that we're not just offering up actionless items. I think the more specific we are in a resolution, the more impact it has with the council.
Thank you. Commissioner Gibrandal?
I have a couple of questions, and I'm not sure if you all know about this, or perhaps Matt does. In terms of kind of some of the assumptions around, you know, we have a pretty stable program. Was anything, did anybody look at the potential Gelman issue in the future, what that could have, you know, in terms of an impact?
That's a different question, but yes, as they've, part of the analysis kind of looks at what are likely capital investments in the future, and rebuilding the water plant is a key part of that. And whether it's Gelman, whether it's PFAS, whether it's, you know, there's a lot of emerging contaminants. So it's not just
Right.
Gelman. Our goal is still to never have that be a problem at the water plant. But there's some assumptions are being made about what kind of space, technology we need. And so that's in there. And so I think, and that's part of this whole rate thing, is how you allocate those costs. So any costs for Gelman, everybody ought to pay for, you know? And so what, does everyone know how we charge for water here? It's an inclining block rate structure. So those of you with single-family homes, your first 700 cubic feet of water, and each cubic foot's 7.48 gallons, is like $1.50 for 100 cubic feet of water. And then once you hit 8, it bumps up to like $3. Problem is, Jennifer Hall with her affordable housing units, because they're multifamily, so if there's 6 units in a building, they're paying a commercial rate. They start at $3. So right from the beginning, people in multifamily are paying more. And the consultants will tell you, well, you can't set a multifamily rate because you don't have good data, and you know, we can't just arbitrarily do this. Well, we have twice-a-day water readings from every water meter for the last 10 years. So, and we inspect every rental housing unit. So even though these databases weren't connected, they connected them, pulled out all the multifamily use, and found that it's flat across the whole year, which means they don't do a lot of irrigation, and so they shouldn't have to pay for we have a 40 million gallon a day system, but the average day is 15 million gallons a day. So the average person should only pay for the 15 million gallon a day system, and big summer water users or big stadiums where they're flushing at halftime, you know, that have this peak demand is where those costs get allocated. So historically, peak costs have been allocated to multifamily because we didn't know better. Now we know better, so those costs are being removed from that group, which means the cost of the system hasn't gone down, so other people's costs are going to go up. And heavy water users in the summertime, the peak users, are going to pay a lot more. Average residential stuff, I'm not sure there's going to be such a big change. But you'll see in the document, they're looking at, I think, 6% increases per year for foreseeable future to make sure we have appropriate capital reserves to maintain the system we have.
And then I had one other question, or comment, I guess. I was at a conference last summer in Denver with the Institute for Sustainable Communities, and they did an amazing case study in the desert Southwest. I think it was in Nevada, and I could chase it down if I needed to, but they were looking at all utilities with this, and as you know, this one city, and they really ended up focusing on how to communicate and disseminate the information, and boy, did they do an incredibly rigorous job with that, getting all providers in the space over a series of times. There was tons of overlap. There were all kinds of issues around the delivery of just the information. And they ended up coming up with this really incredible system. And so we can come up with like all this stuff, but really, when the rubber hits the road, it's about getting that information out to people so that they can do it in the first place. And it was really inspiring to see their whole process with that. So there may be some things to learn from that end of it too, in terms of how that information gets on there. One little anecdote around that: churches were asked a lot for money, not like the Buster's place. You know what I'm saying? It was like your local connection to community leaders in your own group.
So there may be people helping.
So there may be people that we're not even thinking that we're reaching.
Right.
And so I was quite inspired by this group that I just kind of happened to wander into. And I think that there may be some real lessons for how this moves forward with some other innovative work that's been done out there.
And on that point, Lynn Chamowitz, who's on staff, who led this effort, I think they've committed to keeping a group continuing to work on the community engagement and the kind of non-rate opportunities that may be there that we just really haven't explored. And one of our challenges compared to Detroit or Grand Rapids is we don't have those easily identifiable pockets of poverty that are easy to understand, easy to reach those folks. Josh can tell you, we try and help the weatherization group at the county get the word out, and they have real trouble finding eligible poor people, even though they've got money to do the service. So it is one of the things that we're challenged with, both on water, energy, is how can we know who needs help to then provide it.
Commissioner Graham?
It seems to me it'd be helpful if we support a resolution, support the water rate study going forward. And in order to do that, we probably should have some sort of presentation about it here in more detail than this.
Right, this was not that.
Yeah. The council would face very serious dents in the general fund budget if they don't approve the results of this study. Probably be unaffordable, as there are tens of millions of capital costs involved in not just the change in the rate structure, all of it's going up significantly, but the ongoing 5 to 7% increases every year on into the future. The statement by these consultants, who really were very outstanding and have left the city with a model they can use, which is really cool, is that the basic infrastructure inflation cost for maintaining the infrastructure you have is 5 to 7% a year. And that's assuming inflation stays where it is. And I don't think that's true either. We probably are looking at rising inflation over the next decade. So I think it's very important the city passes this. I think it's very likely the council will pass it because of the impact on the general fund if they don't. My second question is to you guys. I'd really like to hear a bit about what you discovered about affordability issues in Ann Arbor, if you're willing to speak on it.
I think it's important for me to do a little disclaimer that one of the reasons why we really encourage, like one of our recommendations was to increase community outreach and doing this sort of qualitative research, is that it takes time to really figure out patterns in access issues and to really to really do justice to the people who we're talking with. And what we saw is that there's, so we interviewed 5 people in depth. And what we saw with those 5 people were that they found alternative sources of water. As like Ms. Gibrandel, you were talking about the churches providing providing money to help people pay their bills. There are homeless shelters that have washing machines that mothers with 2 generations in their household drive to on Fridays or find a ride to on Fridays and supplement their water access through these services. And so they're going outside of their homes so that they can use other water that way. There's also people who supplement their water by buying water bottles, which is not necessarily environmentally conscious. My own grandmother would always have like a bunch of bottles under the table. It's just cheaper that way. Well, I mean, I think there's a perception that it's cheaper, whether or not it actually is. Again, we'd have to do more research to see about the patterns of like how pervasive that is within the community to do justice to the folks that we're working with. And am I addressing your question?
Well, I guess I need, I guess 5 people is not a very good base from which to make many judgments, but it would help those of us who are going to pay a lot more in our water rates to understand that we really do have people have trouble paying their water bill.
So
where that comes from, how that happens.
In one of the cases, there was a mother a single mother who has her daughter who's also a single mother in the home, a multi-generational household. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, I can talk about the grandfather whose wife had a stroke, and he has to bathe her every day, and he uses a lot of water because he has to take care of his wife. He also has his son and his son's wife, and then his daughter's kids all in this house, and they're all sort of temporarily unable to find their own housing, and so their water bill is for a stretch of time that they, aren't necessarily able to define, going to be really, really high. And because he's on a fixed income, as a retired older man, he's unable to meet the needs as well as he would have if it was just him and his wife. So there's a medical condition, there's his children that he's helping, and there's probably lots of people like this since the VA is really close. There's a really, really good and big VA in Ann Arbor, and so there's lots of retired servicemen on fixed incomes, or I'm assuming. Again, this is only 5 people. Oh, and it seems to be that there's a pattern of how landlords interact with their tenants, where there is a disconnect between the people who are direct service, where there's a disconnect between the people who are tenants in these apartment complexes, and they're not direct customers of the water utility, but they pay through a third party. And those people are not necessarily don't necessarily have a relationship with the water utility, and so are unable to make use of the services. This problematic relationship was confirmed by one of the lawyers in our last meeting. I think she was a lawyer. She says she runs into this problem, so I think it might be something that if we were to have more time, we would see that there might be a pattern of injustices or of inability for people to pay because they don't have the kind of relationship, they don't have the leverage that residents in single-family homes have in regards to receiving help paying their water bill. And I think that even if just one person has a problem paying their water bill to help their one family member, I think that's usually enough of a justification for me. As somebody who hears a lot, who doesn't often meet a population threshold, given my racial and ethnic background, I always think, even if it's a small part of the population, I think it's really important that we listen to those people because they matter too.
So it sounds like a monthly billing cycle would be very helpful.
Yeah, especially for somebody who has, like the older gentleman who's taking care of his wife, and might be able to adjust a little easier with his fixed income.
So how do we deal with, maybe it's not your answer, but how do we deal with multifamily houses that have one water meter for the whole building? How do we get the,
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be one of the issues is the rates for multifamily units are going to go down. And if a landlord's paying that bill, it's not necessarily getting passed on to tenants. And there's a policy piece in there that we may want to think about, whether there's a ordinance or something that can, I mean, we can't tell them, but we can, there may be a way to allocate things to residents so they feel that benefit. It also speaks to maybe if we're getting a presentation on the rate study, you might also want to hear from Jennifer Hall and the Housing Commission, Community Action Network, maybe Avalon Housing, where people who are closer to those tenants that are burdened. Is there anyone else that you talked to that I didn't mention?
No, CAN was probably
Good
the
resource?
biggest help. Yeah,
Yeah.
a really amazing resource. And then I think we should maybe check in with churches. They might be another good
question. I have a comment. I mean, I get the point that as a community, we want to take care of every member of our community. And when you say multifamilies, are bearing the burden of me, watering my lawn, it seems unfair and it seems like it needs fixing. But I would have a hard time with a resolution that is based on might or assume or 5 families. Because I think there's something to keep looking in. I mean, I'm not saying that it isn't, but I think I would like us, there's some other piece that I'm missing here, and I think it has to do with, I gotta assume that it's more than just 5 families. But that kind of just, if I'm just at home listening to that, it sounds like that, and I just, but I think that there's a lot more than just saying, let's do a resolution, because it is about saying, okay, if your landlord is going to get the benefit, how does that work? And again, from it makes sense to me that having a monthly payment versus a 3-monthly payment makes more sense. It makes sense to me that multifamily households that are not even really watering their lawns shouldn't have to bear the burden. A lot of this makes sense, but it seems like it's not, I don't know. But I don't know that I would assume that there's a pattern in Ann Arbor based from 5 families.
Right, and I think that was one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to stress the community building aspects of our recommendations, that like through qualitative research, you're able to either disprove your theory, you're either able to prove it, to prove that there are patterns, and you're also getting to see the people who might be impacted. You're building relationships that otherwise.
It seems to me like you've raised the question. I've had, I've interviewed 5 families, and these are questions and issues that concern me. And we still have to do the next step, which is how much is it an issue in our community? And you're right, I think with those churches and other ways of accessing people, it just seems that there's still more steps.
Well, it sounds like we need a more comprehensive presentation about what this cost of service study found, and talk to other people can answer these questions with a little bit more detail. But this is a great introduction to it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks, Matt.
No, thank you.
thank you all.
It's very helpful.
Thanks a lot.
It is. Thank you.
And they're all looking for jobs, by the way, so if anyone on television wants to reach them, just email me, so.
Moving on into our agenda, we have a solid waste program discussion, and In December, we received a presentation from staff about the city's recycling program, and I understand that since there have been some budget recalculations, and I'm hoping Councilperson Smith, you can fill us in a little.
So, while I was not here for the December presentation, we have been getting very dire forecasts for a year now about the state of the solid waste fund. In my discussions with the city administrator earlier this week, he went through the audits and all of the budget numbers and discovered that the information we were given is not accurate. That the solid waste fund will finish this year, and don't quote me on these numbers, but we were told it was going to be a balance of less than $5 million this year, I believe. Based on his work, it looks like the fund will remain somewhat stable at $9 million, at the end of this year.
Is this restricted funds?
No, unrestricted.
Okay.
He will come before us next month. He just finished this work and didn't have time to put it into a memo for us, and was unavailable to come do a presentation this evening, but we will get a presentation and update in February. I think that this is pretty important information for us to have as we start the solid waste plan. I think it certainly impacts some of the recommendations we've made over the last 2 years regarding year-round organic collection, looking at biodigesters. I think, when we had been told over and over that there's no money to do anything, I think getting, a more accurate recognition of the actual state of that unrestricted fund balance is essentially very essential as we pull together a budget. And being that they have started, his office has started pulling together the next 2-year budget and is beginning to think about that, and we are certainly going to, in the process of developing this next year's budget, which is the second year of our 2-year budget cycle. There are not going to be a lot of changes in that, but I think, seeing that the solid waste fund balance is somewhat stable and projected to remain somewhat stable for the near future, certainly has an impact on what happens in the next 2-year budget cycle.
Do we know why we've been wrong for so long? Because since at least 2012, they have been have these dire projections for.
I don't know that I want to put words into the administrator's mouth, but I think some of this was reallocating some of the costs from solid waste fund to other capital improvement costs that had been shifted to other places that were perhaps not allocated as we might expect or hope. I would expect that he will go into a little bit of detail, but in the 15 minutes I had to talk to him about it this week, getting that piece of information just made me happy that, hey, we haven't been crazy, because I think all of us that have been up here for 2.5 years, coming up with very different projections for this fund balance, began to question ourselves. Like maybe we just don't get it, maybe we're not getting the information, and I think that this is going to be very helpful to get us all on the same page as we kind of map out priorities in the solid waste plan and moving forward.
I don't know how to put this in a way that's not. I have to say, the last meeting was very difficult for me when this solid waste presentation occurred, because it seemed to me that I would rather be with my daughter tonight when she has a day off from swimming than being in this committee. And we come up with ideas, and it seems like it predates me by some. And to have someone from the city say, oh, it's a good thing we didn't really hire the person that we have a position for because it saved us money in the end. It seemed like we are trying to do something here, and I do believe that City Council also has or shares our agenda and the mayor, and yet there was a sense that it didn't really matter because at the end of the day, it's the people who have boots on the ground who are going to either implement or not implement. And it just was really difficult to sit through that meeting. And I just had a sense that it didn't really matter what we did here.
Imagine having been working on this issue for years.
And I think it's just incredibly frustrating. I mean, and you know what, and then it was just the holidays and traveling and all that, and so I put it on hold, and then I came back and I have bum knees, so it's just been, but I've just been dying to talk about this, and I've just been sitting on it, you're right, for 6 months, not for 2 years of not, you know, part of why I joined this, and Chip knows this, is that I was like, wait a minute, why isn't Ann Arbor a leader in these issues? You know, we are a wealthy, progressive community. But that was my answer. The last meeting was my answer. You know, whether you talk about it, and I think John brought this point, it's like we have an enormous investment on the MRF and nobody's looking. And there was no sense that we sat through a presentation about composting and all these other stuff. And it made no difference because nobody wants to implement it, or there's a disconnect between what's happening at implementation and what we're talking about here. And I don't know where the disconnect is, and maybe I'm just new, but it was really difficult to accept that.
Commissioner Mirsky?
So I was going to save these comments for sort of an opening remarks about my presentation on metrics and associated reviews of those metrics. But I would say, and also defer to Chair Hutton and others, I think the review actually served a great purpose in that by having a review, by having the city come forward and give us numbers and tell us what's going on, as bad as it was, made the situation transparent.
Yeah.
And I've been a party to discussions since that, and I also, like Councilperson Smith, do not want to say anything in advance of what the administrator will say next month. But I can tell you that these concerns that were raised in the aftermath of that, meaning not only in the aftermath, but during that presentation and afterwards, have led to lots of discussions and concerns about resources, about independent situation appraisals and bringing consultants in, about having some type of summit before the solid waste resource management plan review and the rewriting or the writing of the replacement for that will take place. That really made a difference. And I think as difficult as it was for us to sit through it, the positive was that we understood much better what some of the issues are, and I think there's mounting pressure, if you will, even within the city to recognize what their issues are and what they need to do to be able to resolve them going forward. So often things get ugly before they get better. And I would leave others to comment further on that, but that's my belief. So it was worth it, even if you didn't think it was.
Oh, no, I'm not saying it wasn't worth it. It was just difficult to hear that. I mean, and you know, I'm not gonna, I can take it, but it was just sort of like, what are we doing? Are we spinning our wheels? Where is the disconnect here between the values of us as a community and we advocate in this commission, what City Council stands for, and what our mayor does when he signs the Paris Agreement? I mean, there's a disconnect here between what is being, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that we are all incredibly frustrated. I mean, we have been working on this for a long time. The numbers we had were not the right numbers. The proposals we were making don't make any sense because we didn't have the right data to make them. So it feels to me like we just kind of have to table this right now. We don't know what to talk about. We don't know where we are. And we will have a better understanding in February, and, you know, hopefully then we will be able to move forward. I do have another question. Is there still any update about the conveyor belt?
I don't have one.
So this, like, we've been talking about this
I
since
know
July or August?
I know at least the RFP is out, so we were told it was, I think, about to go out.
Okay.
I know it's out. I don't know exactly the timetable for receiving those, reviewing them, and issuing. But I know the city has moved forward on resolving that issue.
Okay, Commissioner.
Commissioner Han, I just want to say I've been on the commission long enough to remember when the news about solid waste matters was outstanding. And we've gone through, in the last few years, some really incredible bumps. But I think the staff in the city do listen to us and to the community, and I think they'll sort this one out too. I'm thrilled that the numbers were wrong.
Yep, me
in
too.
our positive favor. That they were alarming at the meeting in December, and the trend was particularly alarming, and I'm glad that's better. Thank you.
Commissioner Smith.
So I think this could segue into the agenda item that I had brought up, is one of the things that I think is absolutely essential for this body to be prepared to do is to help shape the solid waste plan RFP and selection of consultant teams. You know, that means identifying some of the things that we want analyzed and studied as a part of this. You know, obviously, we're going to want to understand a fiscal impact of, you know, going to a pay-as-you-throw method as opposed to a straight-up millage. Like, what does that mean? We need to make sure these things are in the RFP and that we're not asking for them later. So I would propose that we form a subcommittee of 4 of us that I would volunteer to chair, to kind of coordinate that process to make sure that we have the information that gets to staff and to Mr. Lazarus about information that needs to be part of this RFP. Because I think based on our experience over the last couple of years, we've had a number of situations where we have been looking, as this commission and city council has been looking for some very specific information and things, and we haven't gotten it as part of those contracts because of the way an RFP was written. So I would like to form a very short-term subcommittee to assist in that meets, you know, between now and when the RFP is issued and the interviews are done, make the recommendation to the.
Just letting you know, the solid waste plan RFPs are due February 8th.
Okay,
So that is out,
okay.
and people are bidding.
So we'll need to meet very quickly to get our foot in as part of the review team. You know, I think what's going to happen if we don't do that is that, you know, a recommendation will go to council without this body's blessing.
Yep.
And I think, you know, I guess the one thing that I would also say to everybody is, you know, the last 2 years regarding solid waste and recycling and organic waste collection and diversion has been incredibly frustrating for every one of us up here. I am really, really hopeful and optimistic that moving the sustainability team into the city administrator's office is going to help resolve many of the issues we have been unable to crack. And, you know, that is to happen imminently. You know, I don't know what the exact time frame is, but the administrator has proposed splitting up the systems planning group and moving the sustainability unit underneath his purview so that they are direct reports to eventually the deputy that gets hired to do that. I think that's incredibly important so that individuals like Matt or Emily or Josh are not sidelined when we're writing an RFP like this, because, it's going to be pretty disappointing if we just get a bunch of people who are going to give us a pretty rote document that doesn't do some of the fiscal analysis that we really need to go forward. Because, we've identified and we've recommended funding, and then council has approved funding for organic collection programs.
Well, and concomitant with that, we need actual numbers that are legitimate
Right.
budget numbers.
Yeah. And so I think
And we had
that.
an organics management plan as well,
Right.
and we are unable to implement it.
So I think if we can put together a four-person subcommittee to kind of meet once to outline kind of what the priorities that need to be included in any team that is selected, and then to advocate for us to participate in the review and interview process with these teams.
Is there a motion to form such a committee?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, sounds great.
I certainly volunteer to
I volunteer.
John and Allison.
All right.
I mean, I'm interested, but I think you have 4, so it's okay.
I think, well, you're welcome to join us.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
great.
Veronica, so,
All right,
yeah.
I like that plan. That sounds great.
What's a quorum for us?
You mean this group?
Yeah,
13, so 7.
okay, 5, yep. Yep.
Okay, I guess we'll move on to new business. Matt, could you talk to us about the policy agenda?
Sure. So we have a new person, Kelly, who is helping run our boards and commissions. And City Council has a policy agenda committee, is that right, Jim? And each year, and this year, they're formally soliciting input from the various boards and commissions. So I would think of this as the city pursues a variety of legislative fixes at the state level. And I think this is mostly at the state level, but if it were at the county or something like that, they'd be interested. We have, if you don't know, we have lobbyists on retainer that work for us in Lansing on a variety of issues. They've done a lot of the work that got done in the Gelman standard change was supported by that group. So I looked at the list from last year, I copied it, pasted it, and based on some of the discussions in this group and other things at Energy Commission, I just added a few items. John commented back to me on a few thoughts. I didn't put them here because I figured that could be part of the discussion. But they're looking for a recommendation by early February, I believe. So again, what doesn't say new is what was in the system last year. I've added a few new things just to round it out, and we'll look for any input you might have.
All right. I don't know if people had a chance to look at these before the meeting.
I didn't get it.
Okay.
I'm not on the
Oh,
list.
I wonder.
okay.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay.
You did you print them out?
There's a
I
copy down
did
at-
print it out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, I
you
I
have it.
have a
Okay.
printed
she's
copy, but I
noticing-
wasn't on the email.
Yeah, okay.
I believe there is now for both Energy and Environmental Commissions a group email address. And that's maybe something we should all start to use, because I know I struggled myself, scratching my head, going through the list, did I get everybody or not? So maybe as a hint for everybody, if we're communicating and we want to make sure it's a broadcast communication, that we use those.
No, this is fundamentally, I made a mistake in I have my own that I keep, because that way if the clerk's office makes a change and it's not reflected in this body yet, I'm not missing someone, so this was just something on my end, so I apologize.
That's okay.
So thoughts?
Commissioner Mursky, do you want to talk about the additions that you had made earlier?
The only thing that I recommended is sort of a fallback. This is my recollection. I looked at it briefly this afternoon. So one of the things that a group of commissioners, both energy and environmental, have discussed related to climate action are ordinances that we would like to work on. And what we would potentially would like to be able to do is use our agent here if there is problem with some of the ordinances that we would like to implement, that we look at legislative means to be able to enable those kinds of ordinances, broadly put.
Yeah, like the state, oh, sorry.
You know, I would just add that, you know, this isn't our only opportunity to do this. I sit on the Council Policy Agenda Subcommittee. Generally, we are often very reactive in trying to react to really bad ideas in Lansing, which is all they seem to be able to produce. But it is, you know, the whole purpose of having this policy agenda subcommittee is to direct our lobbyists, what to work on, what to work against. And the more proactive we can be, I think the more helpful that is to council as a body, and saying, you know, these are issues that, you know, matter and are timely.
And so what's the appropriate way to communicate?
If this list is comprehensive, I think that, you know, we can either pass it as a resolution, or I think perhaps more informally go back through Matt being the staff person who can relay this back to the city administrator, who would then bring that, those recommendations to the council policy subcommittee for discussion and recommendation to a larger body. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Okay.
Commissioner Gibrandi?
Yeah, so I've had a couple of situations within your second bullet here, support and advocate for the incorporation of water reuse and reclamation systems in the Uniform Building Code, where there were, I would say, opinion differences between the city and the county. And so I'm wondering if this is purely on a city and state level, or if there's any room for seeing if there's meeting of the minds at, you know, where we are within the county system as well, especially in regards to gray water.
Sure, I think, you know, if you can identify, or you've got some language that's like, we need to get some uniform guidance at the county level that better reflects the city, or
It's the opposite, actually.
the city's been less.
More open, the county less so.
That's what I.
Yeah, that's
okay.
what I, yeah.
I think just from a matter of process, I think that the council policy committee is focused on directing our lobbyists in Lansing.
Right.
I think as it regards the county, that's a one-on-one staff discussion that we can certainly, this body can say, hey, we advocate the city administrator sitting down with the water resource commissioner or the county administrator and initiating this discussion and putting together a working group to get together. I think that
So this is really state-focused in terms of what's in front of us.
State and
That was my question, is kind of where, because it's advocate for, but it's like, in some ways, we need our own house in order with some of those things in order to be able to, or do people all feel the same about these things within the city in order to, you know what I'm saying?
And I don't know enough about the issue you're talking about, so I'd be happy to sit down with you, see if we can kind of craft a recommendation resolution that would be, name some of those key issues so that it's.
And to me, it sounds like it's probably not part of this list. That's why I was
Right,
curious
right.
about whether it was state or a
But we
little
could
bit
do
smaller
that
than that.
recommendation out of the commission
Yeah.
to the
Okay.
administrator.
So is there a date that we need to have these recommendations in?
I would say that if.
I think it was early February they wanted it, so I think.
Yeah, I
some-
mean, we meet next Tuesday, the subcommittee.
Okay.
You know, it'd be even better if this body could get feedback to Matt tomorrow and he could pass that information along to the administrator, you know, Monday.
Okay,
That could be shared with the three of us that sit on the subcommittee,
okay,
at least for preliminary review.
all right.
And there is not always, you know, unanimity amongst the three of us.
Now, number 3, which is really the area I'm interested in. I think it would fit our vernacular and nomenclature in Ann Arbor a little better if this was saying in the last phrase, natural feature resources and systems.
Sure.
Natural areas are a subset of those.
Consider that change made.
Any other comments, questions?
I like the list. I think it's a good list.
I do too.
Yeah,
Thank you.
All right.
very good.
Moving on, we're going to get a presentation from Commissioner Mursky, but before we did that, I wanted to quickly mention a bit of good news that City Council did approve those 2 FTE positions in sustainability, so we're very happy about that. Also, that I'm sorry for the confusion about this. The Recycling 101 presentation that was on and then off is actually on, and it is scheduled for February 1st at 6:30. And also on February 8th, the second Ann Arbor Sustainability Forum is in the library. The topic is metrics, and Commissioner Mursky will be one of the presenters, and he's also going to talk to us about this tonight, too. So, Commissioner Mursky.
If I may, as we agreed,
Yeah.
I thought before I addressed the metrics issue, I would pick up on something that Susan already addressed as some good news. So reflecting back on last year, I thought it might be worthwhile to look back and see what actually happened last year, and I put together a list. I received input from Matt and Nate Geisler. It was reviewed also by Susan and Wayne Appleyard, and I've since shared it with the administrator, staff in the chain of command from Nate and Matt up to the administrator, so that's Crescent and Craig Hupy, with the mayor, Susan and Wayne, and I shared it in the last Energy Commission, at least excerpts from it. And so I thought what I might do is just pass on a few highlights. And some of these you may know about just from being informed and involved. But the list altogether, I put together what I called wins and disappointments, or as Matt suggested, maybe challenges. But I had, just to put things in perspective, 16 wins and 3 disappointments. And honestly, I think that really does summarize the year. Of course, one of the big disappointments was issues related to solid waste. So that's one of the 3. And concerns about the development with the solid waste fund, which we apparently now know is not quite as bad as what was presented. But just to not go through all 16, but just to give you some insights, we had the resolution that committed Ann Arbor to use 100% clean and renewable energy for all city operations. That was passed in December. We have the millage funds, which is going to generate $900,000 a year for 8 years for climate action. City Council, at Councilperson Smith's initiative, passed a green building policy, which requires LEED Silver minimum standards and a solar potential analysis for any new city construction, facility construction, and for major renovations. The administrative changes and hierarchical changes that were discussed already are also, I think, really important, that there's going to be an Office of Sustainability and Innovation. It's going to be led by, I don't know what the title will be, but whether it's director or whatever, they will have 4 to 6 staff. That's I think that's been presented to council, and it will include the oversight of some key programs, plus now the 2 FTEs that were approved going from seasonal to full-time. There's a Sustainable Ann Arbor program, a neighborhood partnering program that's funded with $100,000 a year, and there's a couple of grants already in process, one of which relates to composting. Met this afternoon with Matt and Derek Delacourt. I don't want to go through all of them. The Greenbelt program crossed 5,000 acres. The tree line was adopted into the master plan. The Green Fleets policy was revived after being basically out of practice since 2012. So I could go on and on. If you're interested, I could share the list, the full list with you. But actually, if you look back on last year, even though there were times I think all of us were incredibly maybe frustrated at times, I think those that I talked with about putting the list together, like Susan and Wayne and I, felt a lot better after looking at everything in retrospect.
Yeah.
So your service, our service, I think makes a difference. That was the message that I wanted to convey.
Thank
So
you.
in terms of metrics, I think it's best maybe if I move to the podium.
Please do.
And I will do that, and I'm going to, if I may, invite Josh McDonald to the podium with me, and we will go through what you've seen already once, but just to introduce it here, what the objective is today, as agreed with Chair Hutton, is to look at what's currently on the dashboard. So we have the sustainability framework, which Matt informed us is formally adopted by council. The dashboard has 38 indicators. That there's some fluidity allowed with that. Maybe we at some point ask for some kind of formal adoption. The Energy Commission reviewed the indicators that monitor energy performance, and we dropped a few and modified a few. So that was done in our last meeting, and based on that experience, we agreed that we would do that today, not with the intent of getting into the mud and talking about targets and things like that with incomplete information, and also recognizing that many of us, including Chair Hutton, believe we should be focusing really on solid waste, certainly for the first several months of this year, and we don't want our attention diverted by digging into a lot of other things. But what we did want to at least do is look at the dashboard, improve it where we can, make sure we're measuring the right metrics, that we get your buy-in. And I've been working with Josh now for several months on this. We met over the phone for about 2 hours today and met a couple times face-to-face. And so what we want is your input and your direction, and in several cases, basically your okay that what we basically propose as a metric, that you agree with that, so that as we dig into data sets and look at how to display that in trend charts, that we're doing that with your blessing. Sound good?
Great.
Good. And I'd also like to say to Josh, he's here tonight and he was on the phone with me today, even though he's on his extended seasonal vacation. So I want to recognize Josh for going above and beyond. So,
in this
Josh.
instance, and many others.
Yes. Yeah. So, thank you, Matt, for getting us set up here. And what I'm going to try to do is maybe move this. Can I move that up? Or how do I go to full screen here? Maybe down. Maybe that might, yes. No, I don't want that. Print preview? Okay. No, that's not going to work. So.
Well, if you set the right print area.
There we are, yep. Anybody?
What are you trying to do?
Just trying to get rid of all this stuff on the top so you can see more at one time.
Can you right-click and, or no, like,
Yep.
when you're in
Here.
the up there, yeah, right-click?
I am right-clicking, not working.
This is a old version of Excel.
Well, we'll try to make do. Since you all have your individual screens, it's going to be a little bit harder for everybody else. So you've seen this before, and what I will do is, first of all, go to the top and refresh your memory that we have a key here. Basically, everything that is green are basically proposals that we're recommending to the commission, and also basically things we want to talk about. There's a few things in here where we're asking for input or want to inform you of some things that are going on. And the yellow means basically things that we thought are low priority, and red means something that we recommend we get rid of. So you chime in here. I'll put this over here. So what I'm going to do is first change this a bit so you can see this better. And since you have screens, we'll do a little bit smaller maybe. Can you still read that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way this spreadsheet is designed, again, is based on the framework. So the framework has themes and goal areas, and then there's indicators. So in the area of sustainable systems, we currently monitor tree condition. Sorry, this is not ideal, but that makes it work pretty well, okay? So tree conditions, and what you can see right now is we have a trend chart with data coming from the city, and what we plan on doing is getting back with Carrie Gray, and we want to talk about a couple of issues that we see here, and we would again like your input. And those issues that we have, or those concerns, are that this is what it says, city-managed tree conditions. So this is X% of the entire tree canopy in Ann Arbor, and we don't know what that percentage is. Is it 5%, 40%, whatever? I mean, it's probably parks and things like that. Nor do we know if that's really representative of the entire tree population in Ann Arbor. So we want to talk with her to get input how representative this really is. If the belief is that it's a good sample and that tree-managed areas border other areas that also have more or less the same condition, then we would be able to continue using this as an indicator of the tree canopy and conditions as it relates, again, here, if you look at the overall goal of sustainable systems is, sorry, this way, is, okay, if you can read, plan for and manage constructed and natural infrastructure systems to meet the current and future needs of our community. So we want to look at, again, tree condition. This would be the metric, and our intention right now is to stay with something like this or Carrie's recommendations. Josh, you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I've been in touch with Carrie Gray in the city as well. We're trying to kind of clarify some of these metrics to make sure we have things like, for example, the total tree population, put some of these numbers into context. So basically getting her take on this would be the next step.
And just to clarify, so it's about 1.3 million street trees citywide in the canopy. That's a guesstimate from Davey. City-managed trees are the trees we have really good data on, and so that was historically about 50,000. We lost 10,000 with emerald ash borer. Planning 1,000 a year, we're kind of getting back close to 50,000.
Right.
But just for, Carrie would know the exact numbers, but the city-managed tree condition where we have them pointed on a GIS map, we've inventoried them, that's about 50,000 trees. And our ability to tell that detailed story for 1.3 million, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
So.
And there are a lot more than that in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, and actually that brings up a good point, and that is, this is only measuring tree condition, and if we lose trees, like 20% or whatever it was with emerald ash, that's not reflected, I guess, in this, is it? Because once they're removed, the population goes down, and we are now looking at what the remaining tree condition is. So there could be changes in population that are not necessarily reflected in tree condition.
And that's why, again, talking with Carrie, so new trees get planted
True.
and fill into this. But then we also monitor the diversity, because that ended up being a huge thing, that 40% of our street trees were maples. And so it's why if you're a neighbor and you want us to plant a maple, we're probably going to say no, but we have a list of 70 other trees you could plant.
Like elm used to be, marching down every street, yes.
Commissioner Brandel, did you have a question?
Yeah, just one quick thing on this. I'm wondering if there's a way, I know that there's some diseases that we're all concerned about coming our way that could have a huge impact, like oak wilt. I know there's another one coming for walnut. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of, that could just like suddenly, you know, kind of like we've seen in the past, have a huge impact on our tree populations, especially in our natural areas, not as much in our parks. And I'm wondering if there's any way to sort of identify what some of those bad boys that could be coming, and in terms of monitoring programs, to like when you see it, it's taken care of and it's cut at the specific time it needs to be cut, and that it's a really targeted program for keeping those things out too. So this is the trend from the past, but how are we dealing with these things coming in from the future as well? So that would be my
that's
other
a
feedback.
good distinction between what I would call a leading indicator and a lagging indicator. And we want to react to leading indicators. And this, as you point out, is in effect a lagging indicator. So maybe that's something
To ask Carrie about.
Well, you may want a presentation from Carrie at
Yes.
some point on, you know, the forestry plan's done. She's now got funding for a 7-year tree pruning cycle, which we haven't had since the 90s. But these are some of the questions that that's exactly the kind of thing that when you want it, let me know and I can get Carrie to come.
And your natural features committee is getting deep into this as well.
Okay.
Right.
John Mursky said, okay, if you want to get somewhere, make metrics.
So what I would say is, we need two things. And I think this was illustrated with the discussion on solid waste. We need not only metrics, but we need a review of the metrics with the experts like Carrie, like the solid waste team. And when you have both and you have an ability to ask the kind of questions that you have that sort of poke and expose issues, that really provides a lot of value to us, and I think the city as well. So I think you need both, not just the metrics.
Yeah.
You need to review them. Any other comments? So we'll go to the next. The next is looking at impervious services. That is something that's important relative to flooding and a lot of other things, ability to take up pollutants and things like that. Maybe jumping ahead is I've had some email exchanges with Laura Rubin of the Huron River Watershed Council, and she knows that we're trying to look at our metrics, and they have a ton of data on the watershed, and Josh and I are going to meet with her on Tuesday and hopefully come back to you with some more specific recommendations. Her feedback was that as a high-level metric, this metric is a good one, and the one that's also monitoring or evaluating, we'll see that later, the condition of the various creek sheds are two top-level metrics. So basically what we're doing here is saying we validated, we think these. In particular, we wanted the one input from you for that discussion, and that is that we typically look at something that is within the city. And the river shed and the creek sheds do not follow the boundaries of the city exactly. So the question is, when we're talking with her, what is the thinking of the Environmental Commission on what should be the geographic bounds of what we monitor and then try to influence through our action or through our advice and the advisory function that we have, what do people think we should be looking at?
So you're saying impervious surfaces not completely in the city?
That probably actually
But
could
the
be.
watershed.
We have to validate that with her. Matt, do you know if it is?
Yeah,
I think this is aerial data,
impervious
correct?
surface in the creek shed that is within the city.
Mhm.
So we're not measuring impervious surface outside of the city boundaries.
Okay.
I guess I think unless Laura has a really compelling reason that we should reconsider it, we should be looking at things that are within the city.
So let me play catchball, if you will. The question is, like, for example, if we're looking at creek sheds and the data is for the whole creek shed and the creek shed is outside of the city, would that still be okay? And would we then eliminate creek sheds that feed the Huron River that don't have any boundaries within the city? Would that be the thinking of the commission?
Right, I think most of our creek sheds are predominantly in the city.
Are they?
There's one
Honey Creek.
piece.
Well, Honey Creek, Fleming
It's
Creek.
different.
There's a couple.
Fleming is not at all, except for a small spur.
Mhm.
And I don't know how much of Honey Creek, but not much. But the big ones are.
Yeah. Okay. One other thought is that we could do a great job monitoring our creek sheds, but if creek sheds, let's say upstream from Ann Arbor, are poorly managed and we don't monitor that, at least, and maybe this is something that is not our responsibility, and that is the responsibility of the Watershed Council, but if other creek sheds, let's say, as I said, upstream are in poor condition, that obviously has a big impact on the quality of the Huron River, which is a key feature for the city. So do you have thoughts on whether we should be looking at that at all, the broader watershed?
Well, it seems that if we're monitoring our creek sheds, we would know if there was something coming from upstream. And I think at that point, that would be the time that we would reach out to whoever else we needed to reach out to and solve the problem.
Right.
And
Okay.
I would suggest that you actually involve, everything is in our county. And our county is keeping track of all of this stuff at the Water Resource Commissioner's office. So in some ways, they might be a very strategic partner in this for you, because they are actively regulating every impervious surface outside of the city, because it's their standards that we're all following. So, and all of those creek sheds are in the county. So you really may be able to get a lot of what you want from them.
Right.
And then the other thing that I think would be interesting to add to this, there's impervious surfaces, and then there's impervious surfaces that are controlled through those regulations. And I think those are very different things. The ones, the old houses that don't have a rain garden, that are just running straight into the system, versus a house that just put in a rain garden, or a new development that was downtown that used to be completely impervious and all of a sudden is infiltrating the entire thing under the building. Those are really different situations,
Sure.
and you do have that data,
Right.
you know, because of everything that is passed through Planning Commission, everything that is passed through, you know, the county. So that's all in there, and I think that would be really interesting to know, me, because I'm a stormwater geek, I think that's interesting to know, how much of that is changing and how much of that is influencing and healing our creeks.
Right.
Because that's important too, is understanding the story that our regulations are helping these
Yeah.
things. And not just the regulations, but the opportunities for individuals to do them through things like the county rain garden program, and people getting credit on their stormwater bill because they're doing X, Y, Z. And so all those little pieces are coming off, and I think that's part of the important story to tell too.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
So we will talk to Laura. Our focus with your agreement and input is that what we would like to do, I think, at our level and also close to our residents, are outcomes. And when we see that outcomes are not what we want them to be, then we start digging down to the next level of the leading indicators. What do we need to do policy-wise, things like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know where stormwater goes as a sustainable system, but it seems to me that maybe it fits in this section somehow.
What would be the metric? Quantity? quality? Maybe that's something we talk
It's
about.
both those
Laura,
things,
she,
yeah.
I'm sure, is very familiar.
Yeah.
Well, and Jen Lawson, who runs our
Jen,
stormwater
right.
program
Mm-hmm.
with, but I think Commissioner Gibrandal's point is, every planning project has to do stormwater detention.
Yes.
And that's all part of the process, but it's not something we currently aggregate the data
Right.
to tell that story.
Right.
And so what I think I'm hearing you say is you're making a recommendation
Yeah.
that this group also identify some things that data are available, we could do a better job tracking.
Yeah. And impervious surface, and I agree, Chris, that it's kind of impervious surface / stormwater, because we're looking at impervious surface in that context, not just because, I mean, we could look at it within, it's,
Heat island.
heat island potential too. But I do think that's probably the biggest thing that we tend to measure impervious surface for in the city is because of stormwater.
Thanks for your input. So we'll go to the next one. This is in a new category. This is under transportation options. And what we currently are looking at, is the percent of non-motorized commutes. And you can see we do have trend data here, but in looking at that, so unfortunately, Matt, I had you load an old version of this, so we're gonna have, Josh and I have to do this from memory. But what we looked at in the metric subcommittee, and Josh and I, is we believe that there are some STAR indicators that are being tracked anyhow, or had been tracked in order for our submission.
Sure.
And we think in general, it's nice if we have a lot of overlap with STAR, because then we can do benchmarking and things like that, and we don't have additional work for the sustainability staff if we're doing an upgrade of or an update of our certification. So what we propose to do is to look at the various options that are shown here. Let's see, I'm sorry. So do you remember exactly what we were gonna do with this?
So I think
There's,
yeah, one of the questions as far as the transportation things go is whether we can talk to someone on the transportation committee
yeah.
to be able to kind of cross-reference these and make sure that these are the things they want to track. I'm not sure. I think maybe you had a recommendation that, I'm not sure. Chip, are you also in the transportation?
Not anymore.
Oh, not
Okay.
anymore.
So, yeah.
Who,
Zach Ackerman,
should we talk to Zach, or who's the chairperson of it?
Linda Diane Felt.
Okay.
I think you can talk to both of them.
Okay.
Kayla Coleman is the coordinator. I think, going through her will expedite things.
Okay. So that was our intent, is to try to actually get data that's a little bit more insightful than this, and have it something that's aligned with STAR, and also that the Transportation Commission buys into. So this is not something that's just coming from energy or environmental, but all of the key stakeholders in terms of commissions would have input on that. Sound good for everybody, or any other advice or direction? So, okay, good. So, oops.
And automobiles.
Yes. So there's another metric that's in the dashboard that is based on the National Citizen Survey, which is just basically a question that asks citizens about the relative ease of travel within the city. And you can see we have that as designated with red, with concern, because we feel that this may not really be pushing the city to sustainability. It may push to making vehicle traffic a lot more easy and things like that. Not that citizen perceptions are a bad metric, and it's probably something that we think we do want to monitor, but the idea is that we would look at some of the star metrics that relate to that, and there is a star metric that we thought we would adopt and look at. Do you remember it again? I'm sorry. This is.
Yeah, I think there was 3 different star metrics that kind of related to overall ease of travel. Again, I think getting some input from the Transportation Commission. One of them has to do with public transportation, so buses. Another indicator has to do with sidewalk, so kind of pedestrian-friendly cities. And the last one has to do with bicycles. So, do you have dedicated bike lanes?
How many miles of those kinds of things
yeah.
that really stress more the sustainable aspect of transportation as opposed to simply the ease of that transportation.
Yeah. And I think for these metrics, we don't necessarily have to choose one. I mean, I think maybe a combination of the 3 might really get at what the city's doing. So that's something that we might cross-check more with transportation if we find something there as well.
Sounds good.
Yes.
I don't know if it's in here in regards with bicycle transportation, but quality of bicycle lanes. I know that the city does a quality of street assessment, and sometimes that lines up well with bike lanes, and sometimes it does not. As the 3 flats that I've gotten in that block of Fifth Avenue can attest.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I do too.
Good point.
Which I think is another point, that raising these things where we may not have good data, but where this group says this is the appropriate metric, and so you need to figure out a way that when they're doing paver or whatever, how do you make sure that that's being monitored? And I think that sensor technology is only getting better and better and easier, so I think even if you don't think we have data, but you think there's a good metric, that's something that should be part of this.
So you're reminding me of something, actually, in terms of the sensors, and this is a little random, but it would be interesting to include it in here as well, is many of the traffic signals that are the smart ones don't pick you up as a bicycle, and if you're the only one in the lane, then the light never changes. So that would be an interesting metric, too, is like which of our smart intersections even pick up a bicycle. I don't know if it is even possible or not.
Or the change in the specification
Right.
for those, for example.
Right, exactly. Is there a way for them to tune them or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've been saying for a long time that the progression of vehicles along most of our roadways is very poor. And that has a climatic and environmental impact, a fuel waste impact, and a frustration impact with people who drive. And almost all of this is oriented toward bicycles and pedestrians and so on, but the folks paying for the facility need some attention also.
True. Well, there is, I know, a metric that is not in the framework that maybe needs to be, and maybe we should note that, where the city has identified, Chip, I'm going to call on you, but there's a percentage of streets to be resurfaced and a target of 80% by a certain year. Frankly, one concern that I have with that metric is it's not really an outcome. It says that we're going to do something, but as I think we can all attest, we've all driven down some streets where 5 years ago they were resurfaced, and the quality today is disastrous or approaching that.
I think that metric's highly suspect in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Well, it's based on a PASER rating, which is, designed for cars, cars only. But, it is the preferred way of traffic engineers to evaluate our road system. And I don't know that that's the metric. That is what our goal is. I think the metric then becomes what are the annual Paiser ratings and what are the, you know, are we making progress towards 80% of our streets being in good or better condition?
Right. What are the thought of including a measure like that in the dashboard? There is nothing like that in the dashboard right now.
Yeah, I think as far as the measure goes, you know, putting on the dashboard what our percentage ratings are. You know, we just had a citywide Paiser analysis done 2.5, 3 years ago.
Okay.
You know, what is it now? You know.
So trending that as a
Right.
top-level metric?
Right.
Yeah, okay. We'll look at doing that then. Okay.
And that should be easy enough to get out of Nick.
Okay.
Good.
So I think that was the next one. Things of travel. So yes, now this is under land use. Again, this is another metric that we're currently monitoring, again, based on the National Citizen Survey, which is taken every 2 years. It's supposed to be taken, I think, and is budgeted for the next fiscal year 19 budget, correct? I'm pretty sure that's the next time. So this last time was 2015, so I don't know, there's not a data point for 17, but I think the intent is to take it in the second half of this year. So we may not be exactly on a 2-year, but yeah, you can see it's been somewhat irregular, 2007, 2008, 13, 15, but it is periodic. The only problem with this is we don't really know if this fulfills the goal that you see here on the right side, that just a citizen survey is telling us whether or not, how do I get this? That it's encouraging a compact pattern of diverse development that maintains our unique sense of place, preserves our natural systems, and strengthens our neighborhood corridors. So our sense was that this is something that probably will continue to measure through the survey, but is not necessarily a good indicator of what we're looking for on the dashboard. And again, my mistake to give Matt the wrong file to load in here, because we did update some of these things.
Is it on your jump drive?
It is. Can you look?
I'm wondering if it
Do you have-
maybe
Yeah.
makes sense to
Is it
skip
easier for you?
to
Is it-
the
you know-
solid waste ones that we talked about being the highest priority just for the sake of time.
I gotta click around a little bit, but.
Can we do it right from here? Okay. It's on that.
We've got to get these other ones set. We're gonna set.
So, and our land use planning and zoning is relatively static.
It's important to go through and do it.
I mean, we aren't doing annexations of empty land north of Dallas. I mean,
So maybe, why don't you slide over and address it? So one thing I think with these metrics is, some of these we're not moving the needle year to year in any significant way. And that's why a lot of these we're only taking data and posting it every year, every couple of years. I mean, that's true also, for example, I'll speak for one of the metrics we're looking at in the Energy Commission, and that is our greenhouse gas emissions. You know, that's not changing dramatically year to year. Or creek shed quality, one of the emailing back and forth with Laura Rubin, she said, you know, these are things that are changing over decades. And that's why some of these metrics we would not necessarily review, but once a year or once every 2 years or something like that.
I just wanted to say, I know it's a laborious process to go through this, but I
Yes,
think the
sorry.
situation that we're in with the solid waste fund is case in point, that we don't have good metrics to measure. We're flailing around, and if we are able to establish good metrics, then we can be a little more rational and logical and effective in our progress toward doing things. So it's a long, tedious process, but if we do it and we get these set and useful, then we can use those to dictate our recommendations and proposals.
Well, I'd add that, you know, if, as we're looking at these things, there's data that we should be collecting to have better performance measures, then we should identify that data that we need to collect.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I think.
which is a useful metric then.
Right.
You know, as we're seeing with the review, the solid waste review that was referenced multiple times now, the value of that is we're also, as we do this, optimizing the metrics. So what we recognized in the solid waste review in December and in subsequent email correspondence that I had with Crescent Slaughton, there are several waste streams that are not in our diversion rate. And so by reviewing these things, some of these issues then are raised. Then we have a decision, okay, which waste streams do we want to monitor or not? Obviously, there's a cost for monitoring every one. Some of them may be inconsequential. But just one of the things that is not in the metrics we talked about in that review, okay, so I'll keep this short, and that is we talked about, and what was presented was in the recycling stream, the non-recoverables. That's 10% to 11%. That could be then 3 or 4% alone negative impact on our diversion rate, because that's currently not in the diversion rate. That goes to landfill. We said it's stuff that goes into recycling. We measured as recycle, but actually 10 to 11% of that goes back into the landfill. So I use that as an illustration. As we have these discussions, we recognize where metrics are maybe misleading us or where they need to be improved, where we need to then focus to improve performance. So these do add value over time, and it is laborious, and we won't do this every meeting, but if we have a review maybe once every year or once every 2 years where we do a deeper dive on these, I think we're going to understand a lot better where we need to improve.
I agree.
So do you want to do the next one?
One of the points of the NCS throughout the metrics, sometimes the NCS captures something that we're trying to look for, but sometimes it can also be subjective. So it's almost like we want it to be possibly accompanied with something that's a little bit more objective, something that we can measure that's actually, we can get it, you know, features or actual structures, things of that nature. So, and specifically with the built environment, this land use planning and zoning, we did find, again, a star indicator that kind of gets at public libraries, public schools, public spaces, and we found that that might be something where if people have access to those things, you know, it's kind of a GIS exercise, you can start to plot out, is this something that the city of Ann Arbor does well, and if not, how should we be spacing things, right? So something that could actually be actionable if necessary.
Good idea.
Then overall built environment is another one. This is another one with NCS. Let's see. And this kind of gets at the same thing. So if there is interest to continue to use NCS, could we use it in combination with other metrics that help to kind of balance out both the experience lived by the community as well as measurements that we can track over time?
And potentially then use to better educate residents that may just have a subjective, non-data-based perception. So at least we can come back and say, actually, here are some other outcomes that you can look at, true metrics, and based on that, now you're better informed. What do you think in light of that?
We're also wondering for this one in particular, whether something like the green belt, if we look at encourage a compact pattern of diverse development, the green belt kind of hits at some of that. That maintains our unique sense of place, preserves our natural systems, so it also helps to preserve natural systems. So we were wondering if that's something that we might include in this section, or whether that might even be something that can get at overall built environment.
And in particular, in these cases, this is where we would like your input. So we reviewed these in the metrics subcommittee. We said there are significant shortcomings with NCS, for example, because it is subjective. It's not really based necessarily on data. And with any of you that have expertise or that can guide us to someone at the university or whatever, where we could look at what might be a better metric other than what we have and other than what's in STAR. So that's the kind of feedback we would like from you. If not, we will pursue STAR and what we've shown with potential of maintaining these as both sort of a subjective, what residents perceive, and then something that's objective that covers that and provides data that speaks to the desired outcome from the framework. Any insights for this one?
Mr. Apple?
Yes.
It's a little mishmash of categories here, but I think a GIS exercise would give some very interesting information about livability and walkability that could ultimately help to inform more planning decisions, particularly in regards to where PUDs are necessary, appropriate, or even needed in terms of being able to meet multiple needs for particular neighborhoods.
And that's in the 1 STAR metric that Josh is talking about. We don't have access to that data right now. That's a little bit of an issue. Matt, do you know if that's changed? Josh's understanding is we don't.
Should be changed imminently. We got a scholarship to do STAR, and it requires some funding to keep it up. And until recently, we weren't sure where that was going to come from. The check got mailed on Friday, so we should have access to our data. For those that are interested, despite I hadn't told them anything, but our stuff is live. So you can go look for Ann Arbor and look at each of the metrics that we put in data for. You'll see a bunch of areas where we got no points, and a lot of that was we didn't either know the data was out there, couldn't find it. It speaks to what we would do to get recertified, which is every 4 years. But and the plan is also to give you a presentation on the STAR certification in February. I was hoping Emily could do it, but she's not going to be at that meeting. So either you let me do it or we wait till March. So I'll let you guys decide on that. But right now we're planning to give you a presentation on STAR in February.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Oh, it wasn't really a question.
Okay.
It was more of a suggestion of how this data could, where some of this information might be able to come from and how it might help to inform decision-making.
Because I agree, it's a huge category. You know, it's too big in a lot of ways, because just sitting on the planning commission, I mean, you could measure this in terms of density and say compact, you know, that's you've got there is compact and everything, but some people hate the density. And so you got the green belt, you need density, but then there's some people that hate seeing anything over 3 stories. So there's just a lot of moving parts to that. And it feels like this could be broken down into like 10 different pieces or something in terms of kind of people's attitudes towards it versus the walkability stuff that you're talking about. You know, I mean, it's admirable to include it at all, and then but to figure out how to really make it an effective thing to measure, I think is going to take some parsing in a way that's going to take some kind of creative thinking about how to do that. And I'm not prepared to be able to think through all that. I may have some ideas on it, but I feel like that may be, I suggest you actually talk to Alexis. I think she deals with a lot of some of that stuff at the city, at the planning department, and she may have some ideas about how you might be able to disaggregate this a little bit, to be able to get at different dimensions.
Great.
Yeah.
The other part that I briefly might add here is, you know, there's certainly a quality question about what built environments, particularly built landscapes, are and their impact. A new neighborhood that has primarily mown lawns will certainly be much higher environmental impact than the old fields that were there. But that same built environment that has new stormwater features, rain gardens, that sort of thing, could actually improve the local environment. So these things are ridiculously subjective and very difficult to be able to put together. I just put that out there because, thanks. you're doing our job.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is an iterative process, as we were just saying.
Yeah.
And we're not going to solve it and fix it with the first iteration, but we're going to get hopefully closer. And as we look deeper again the next time, then we'll get closer and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Right, go to the next one.
So the next category is local food. If we go down here, let's see if we can, I don't know if we can get the description, but we'll try. Nope. Basically, it's just making sure that there's adequate agricultural and aquacultural resources.
And availability of healthy local food
Right.
for residents.
Yep.
That's what the framework describes.
Yeah. Currently, we have SNAP and EBT purchases at farmers markets. We're a little afraid that that might not necessarily include everyone. It might be a little skewed. We don't know if everyone's necessarily taking advantage of SNAP, but we kind of want to get a full-on picture. So some things we talked about, let's see over here, possibly using a star indicator once again. So looking at local fresh food. There's two ways that we can get at this, and I think even in the submetrics committee we talked a bit about this, looking at, for example, farmers markets. There was a bit of a question as to how accurate we could get with farmers markets, because even if, for example, we have information for farmers markets throughout the city, are we counting stalls? Are we actually counting purchases? It's a lot harder to get at, for example, purchases, even though it'd be a much more accurate measurement. So that is one thing that we're kind of trying to figure out currently.
So the outcome of the subcommittee, Allison and Susan, by the way, deserve recognition for contributing and sitting through all those meetings. But was that we felt this was a poor indicator and we wanted to drop it. So it's extrapolating SNAP purchases at the farmer's market and is saying, based on that, the city overall and residents have access to healthy local food, which we think is really a huge stretch. But we really don't know a good way of looking at this. I've read one article, I'm not an expert at all in this field, that says that some studies have shown that a survey of residents, in this case where the survey is actually fairly representative, where people have studied that, and if you ask residents and you actually then go to shelves in supermarkets, it seems to correlate pretty well. But trying to go to all the Plum markets and the Argus Farms and the Whole Foods and the Kroger's and get a sense of what percentage of their food is healthy local food and trying to consolidate that is virtually impossible, we think. And so I don't know if there's anybody on the commission that can guide us, again, with advice on who to talk to improve this metric or possibly just drop it if it's garbage. We shouldn't be spending anybody's time even to plot it and put it on the website if it's meaningless.
I think Jason Frenzel might be a good resource for this.
Okay.
I also might mention that maybe looking at it as local food is too broad a way to look at it. Maybe you need to look at this as food security, because SNAP is giving you information about people who need this supplemental food assistance, and their ability to be able to use that in the community is a little bit different and not necessarily directly correlated with local food.
Yep, and that's useful data for the city to have.
Yes, it's important, but it doesn't fit in the framework, which is the formal document or framework that we're trying to operate in. Maybe there's a section under community that we didn't look at, that something like that might make a lot more sense. The community kinds of things are related to, for example, affordable housing and quality education, economic development. We did not look at those metrics. We just looked at ones that were strictly environmental and energy related. But I'll make a note of the point, but I think it's a discussion with another group under sort of another set of leadership, if you will.
You might also consider Project Grow as another data point.
Yeah.
That's measurable.
We're almost there.
All right, so the next one is green belt land preserved. I think this one was mostly a charting problem. We had to rechart some of this. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, there was a question as far as the assumption that the green belt, that the food that is actually grown in the green belt is sold within Ann Arbor city limits. If we're talking about, for example, feed for livestock, that's not going to necessarily be seen in Ann Arbor. So it really is getting at what the green belt is used for, and whether it should even be, for example, in the food, in this food category for local food.
So, for example, land could be put under conservation or be a part of the green belt, and it's going to be preserved as farming, but what could be farmed on that property is a monoculture that is GMO or corn or whatever that has nothing to do with local food and quality and accessibility of local food. And what we're implying right now with this dashboard metric is that if the green belt is growing, then you can sort of infer that there's more local food and the quality of that local food is good for residents. And we think that's, if anything, that should maybe be moved up into another category, like under land use or something like that. So we actually talked about that. The other thing, though, is that a lot of this land, getting back to a discussion earlier on watersheds and things like that, a lot of this greenbelt land is actually not in the city. So advice from you, do we drop this altogether? What are your thoughts on this?
It's nice to know what's happening. I mean, it's a city-funded program, city and federal government-funded program, and it's nice to know that the arrow's going up. But
It's not, though.
but I'm not sure
trend-wise,
really,
It's not. If you look at
doesn't really relate to food directly.
land added, the trend really is, it shows it's going up, but it actually, if you look at it from a trend perspective, amount added to the green belt, there was a huge jump in the beginning, and then it's dropped down to, you can see these little slivers that have been added since. So, yeah, if we were to use this, we would change the way we chart it. The question is, do we even invest time in charting this, or is this something that really is not an indicator for the framework, or at least particularly for this this theme area and this goal area?
In order to buy it a lot to begin with.
I say drop it.
I do too,
Yeah.
unless
Drop it.
someone who knows this better.
Yeah. Great. I mean, that doesn't mean someone else won't monitor it somewhere else.
I mean, the Greenbelt Commission is gonna continue to monitor how many acres they add, how many proposals they get, but I don't think it's needs to be something that we're monitoring as part of our
Certainly
framework.
not related to food.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, definitely.
Great. Is that the last one? Okay.
So,
Yeah, we do have a couple more, sorry.
Yeah, this is air quality, and I think this one is good to go from what the submetrics committee, we went over it. Basically, it comes from the EPA, it's a really good source.
So this whole category is basically the quality of the air and water in the community. And we think, as Josh just said, this is a good indicator from a reliable source. It's easily trended. We have no targets. We can talk about that later. And EPA, I think, sort of sets a target that we could use as a basis. Again, that's maybe a discussion for later. But at least in terms of building the framework and charting properly, our recommendation would be to maintain this.
Yep.
And there's also a star indicator that we could cross-reference to be able to compare with other cities, and so I think it's a great metric.
Good.
Let's see, so green infrastructure capacity, I believe we had green street policy for this. There was a question as to what the metric would be, if it's even really good fit for this section.
So what you see in the middle of your screen is basically a cut and paste from what's posted right now. And you can see there's really no data. So our thought was, that's why the red designation is we drop it. That doesn't mean we can't revisit this later, but if there is a better idea.
You totally have this data. This is stuff, this is in the CIP. This is what the city is doing all the time with their green streets policy. They know which streets they've converted to that and not. That's a matter of asking somebody in my book.
So what would we trend chart to say
Is
we're making
what,
progress against
how
the target?
much of, how many lineal feet of green streets are you adding per year? And usually green streets are also coupled with, some of your transportation goals too, so that also might help you with some of that data, because when you do the green streets thing, they also have to look at, bike lanes and all those other things too, so some of those, by tracking that, you might be able to track other things as well.
Right.
And so I think the green streets thing is a pretty easy one actually to plug in to that. But this also relates back to some of the stormwater stuff we were talking about too, that if you start tracking that, you can say, well, this many, square feet of impervious surface is now being controlled, so that's another one that, could feed into that, one as well.
A lot of the stormwater flooding repair projects, the $160 million worth of them are all gonna involve green infrastructure to store water.
Yeah, so any new development, all that stuff, plus things that the city is, they're doing initiatives all the time. RFPs are coming out all the time for things that they're doing. So I think like Jen Lawson's a good person to talk to about that high level, what are some of the things that have been happening over the last couple of years? Because there's been a whole lot that's done, so it may be that, things aren't quite moving as fast maybe as they were 10 years ago when some of these things were first getting adopted, but I think it's important for us to keep moving forward with these things too and to be able to track that, so.
Could measure stormwater storage. Just that number would be.
Yeah.
So maybe we keep the metric and maybe just it fit better maybe under another category. That would be the way to go about it. So this is kind of air.
Is under
It's
clean,
under-
clean water and clean air.
Well, it's clean water. I mean, that's what green infrastructure mostly is around stormwater.
And slowing the runoff.
Right, which is the stormwater. So
Okay.
if you can capture the green streets stuff, and then if you can capture what, new developments are bringing things offline, then that feels like two things that you can
public development
totally
and private
track.
development.
Totally track.
Yeah.
All that data is there.
Much volume.
The data's there, we are not,
You don't have, no one's
Aggregating
collected
it,
it or
so
aggregated it,
still
exactly.
can create the metric though, and then
Right.
drive that
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
collection.
That's
And
exactly what we want.
it would be interesting as part of the site plan submission process, that, because that's the easy time to measure that stuff, right? Is that, the staff person or the developer, whatever, takes the 2 minutes to say it's this many square feet, or that, whatever, to be able to enter into an ongoing collection process.
Right, yeah. There's not a field in Track It for that, and
Right.
that's where it's gonna need to go.
Right.
Okay, good stuff. Then we get to EV charging stations. I think the recommendation on this one we kind of came out with is doing both EV charging stations, but also the number of electric vehicles. We recently actually pulled that data from the state.
So the state has registrations, and with that, we know the type of vehicle,
Yeah.
and we can then look at what is the number of vehicles in Ann Arbor, maybe on a percentage basis or on an absolute basis, that are cleaner vehicles, hybrids or electric vehicles, and plot that and use that information as an indicator of whether we're making progress. And the other thing that Josh and I talked about is this is only the number of EV charging stations that are under the DDA umbrella. And there are websites, both DOE, and then there's something else called PlugShare. It's a little bit dubious because it's self-reporting to some degree, but it gives a much better view of how many charging stations there are. So if we're saying the more access there is, and this is also, I spent an hour with Charles Griffith at the Ecology Center. He said this is a very good leading indicator for electrification of transportation. So based on that, our recommendation is that we would try to look at the total number of stations, we have to go and find out what is the best data source for that, but then also use the registrations as an indicator, another indicator of the final outcome, how many people are actually buying, and then if we see that we're not making enough progress with the charging infrastructure, then we know that we need to do more. So our recommendation would be to do both.
Yep.
A little bit different than what the red is indicated here. We would still measure this, but we would take it from a different data set.
Could we just find out from DTE the number of charging stations there are, because they're on a separate rate?
Well, they're
Not necessarily,
Right.
though, I
Well,
don't think.
I mean,
But DTE might be.
we've been asking, so we're trying to get that data, but it also, you're missing somebody with a volt who's just plugging it into the wall.
Right.
So there's this, so I
Oh,
think
yeah,
this,
good
a few of these indicators taken together may help tell a better story, because the registrations are good, except the Secretary of State, if you live in Scioto Township and you have an Ann Arbor address, you're an Ann Arbor car. So we're gonna miss some things there. DTE will give us the charging stations, these other sources. So, you know, I think you're definitely on the right track. It's just none of this is perfect at this point, but pretty good.
If the data set is somewhat consistent over time, then we can deduce trends. And sorry, I know this is getting into the mud, but these data sources do indicate also, you know, whether it's residential, whether it's a charging station that's level 1, level 2, level 3, I think they're called, which is basically slow charge out of the plug, 240 or 480, like a Tesla kind of type. So we could do a stack bar kind of a chart to show how many, how are they split up, are they truly publicly accessible, and trend something like that. So basically our recommendation is expand this metric and also add vehicles from the state with some of the caveats that Matt mentioned, but those lines will probably, that differentiation, that will be constant over time.
Right.
So it's probably okay.
Are electrical permits issued by the city searchable
You mean like for a charging station?
for charging for the electronics required to do these things, more or less?
It's a dryer hookup.
I think it depends on the level,
It
from
does.
what I understand.
So
Depending
you
on
get
what
some
kind
of them out of there, but not all of them.
You know.
Yeah, if you're doing
Yeah.
a supercharger, I think it's.
Yeah, it's just,
Yeah, if you buy I mean, I own one. If you buy one and you just use 120, which we did for quite a while, and you charge it overnight, there's DTE or nobody knows, there's no permit. If you have to do something where you're putting in a new circuit and everything else, and you have to pull a permit to go to 240 or 480, then you would know, but
But
I
as
think.
Susan said, you may be pulling a permit for a 240 outlet, not a
Yeah.
charger.
Correct.
You could,
Yeah.
you pull the same permit to put in a dryer,
Yes,
right,
right, that's true.
just
They
a
don't-
dryer
they
in
don't
your
need to be plugged
garage.
into it.
right.
So again, tree canopy target by land use, I think we're getting into, let's see, healthy ecosystems is a category. And again, this is another one that we were gonna talk to Carrie Gray a little bit about. It kind of relates back to the first one, just having a better sense as to how many trees we have. I think Matt's comments were really helpful in starting that conversation as well.
And we would work with her to get something that could be trend charted. This is a snapshot, so we have no sense, is this getting better or is this getting worse? So we would try to work with some way that displays the data that also then is meaningful to us in terms of it getting better or getting worse. So we will talk with Carrie. And again, we've got a page plus of notes, so this is worthwhile for us, even though it's laborious for you. Any additional, any comments on this?
Thank you.
Why is it separate from the first category?
Good. And I think maybe this is another thing to think about. Maybe the way we do the dashboard is we have some indicators that are not rigidly under one goal area, but then are indicative of multiple
Got it, yeah.
goal or theme areas. And that's what we're we're seeing in multiple cases.
And just to clarify, so the healthy ecosystems, the systems is the,
Right.
we look at the street trees as part of the stormwater utility. It's part of that system.
Oh, so was that first category?
That
was all
first category was just
stormwater?
the 50,000 trees.
No, but that's in the stormwater category?
I think it's, I can pull it up.
Sustainable systems. So-
Sustainable systems, so.
And then healthy ecosystems
I get it.
Carrie's then looking canopy-wide.
Sure,
By land use, you know, we can do that GIS math.
right.
The question I've got there is, how often are we doing leaf-on flyover data? Because we
Not very often.
use leaf-off
Right.
for the impervious surface and stormwater. And, you know, is that just like a national data source, or is that our data source? So
Right.
this is again where we're gonna get into the weeds and find out, but, that's why that may be something that we're monitoring every 5 or 10
Right.
years. So, because I know it's not annual.
I just want to add one other note that we invite you to some of these meetings. So whether you need to be there at all of them is another matter, and we will certainly come back to you.
No, it would be
But
great.
your insights are great.
Yeah. You stay here long enough, you learn some things, so.
All right, let's see. So the next one is watershed health.
I think we can skip that. We're going to cover that as we discussed with Laura, and we'll come back with her recommendations as an expert and bounce that off of you one more time.
And then finally, we're in a different category here, responsible resource use, and we have percent waste diverted. I think there was a few points that you had on this one.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned them already. You can see here, this is green. We recommend that we maintain this. The real question here is, how is it actually calculated? If you think about SMART goals, how specific is this? What waste streams are in, which ones aren't in? Some may be negligible and shouldn't be in, but there's others, like the example that I gave earlier, that probably needs to be reflected. So the basic metric is a good one. This is just a matter of refining it and being real clear on what the definition is and measure it on that basis going forward.
I think also tracking the municipal solid waste, the garbage that's being landfilled, and comparing all of these diversion rates with the population would be really helpful. So we can see, you know, are we landfilling more per household?
So there is a STAR metric, actually, thank you. And it's like a, where I come from in industry, a zero defect goal, in a sense, for quality. In this case, STAR metric is saying, how much do you, quantity-wise, send to landfill? Doesn't matter how much in a percent you're diverting, still, you should have a goal that you're constantly reducing what's going to landfill. And maybe that's another thing that we look at. So not only what is our diversion rate, but then how many tons of stuff are we sending to landfill, and, you know, what do we need to do step by step to get that to start to approach zero?
To that point, I think it's, you know, the current metric kind of makes us look like we're doing a better job than we are.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think to Commissioner Skinner's point, like, I think to talk about that stuff in the context of how much is going to the landfill and quantifying those three totals to show how much more is going to the landfill than is being actually diverted is particularly useful. I think some of the information that also needs to be measured is, you know, how many organic carts for organic waste are out there. You know, we don't have that information. Nobody knows. And that's the type of thing that I'm hoping that this exercise can push us to start collecting, you know, that information, because we don't have a great sense of, you know, volume of organic waste collected.
And food waste specifically too.
Yeah, there's actually, we can get into it maybe some other time. There's a neighborhood partnership program or green grant that's in process right now. I may have mentioned it in a previous meeting. We had a meeting this afternoon with Matt and with Derek Delacourt, and it looks like that will get funding. It's going to be a pilot program, and we hope to, on a pilot basis, capture the kind of data that you're talking about. Also look at what we're doing in terms of increased organics and composting food material. And if that proves successful, then that would be a model then that we could roll out citywide and would provide then that kind of data also then citywide. So I think there's some progress in doing exactly the kinds of things you're saying we need to do at a small scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And then the last one, yay, is recycling collection. So this one actually comes from NCS. We didn't know if this measurement might be a little redundant, given the fact that we're already collecting those numbers from this previous, the waste diverted. Those are more hard, concrete numbers as far as what we're diverting, but we'd love your guys' feedback and input.
The subcommittee, basically, that's the red. Our feeling was, if we have other sort of high-level outcome-based metrics, like the total amount going to landfill and diversion rates, this is sort of meaningless. It doesn't really tell us much. Agreed?
I still feel that way.
Yeah.
And in terms of people thinking of the program positively, that we did just, I believe with the organics plan, there was that big telephone survey. So that would probably be more relevant than NCS.
You're probably right, yeah. I think the city won't stop collecting and asking these questions on the survey. We could still go back and refer to those. We could still go back and refer to the data set you're talking about. It's not that those disappear, but to monitor them as a top-level outcome, implying that we're performing well, we're saying it's probably not very good. But if we need to ever dig down, that data would be available to look at.
Thank you, and
That's
thank
it.
you, everybody, for slogging
you.
through that.
Yes, indeed.
Are there any other reports from committees? Yes.
From the Pollinator Committee.
Mhm.
So our goal is to work towards a pollinator-friendly city by encouraging and coordinating local pollinator habitat and awareness activities in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County. Just to give you an idea of what other communities are doing, both East Lansing, Michigan, and Boulder, Colorado have passed resolutions that recognize the importance of pollinators to local economies and ecosystems. East Lansing resolved to become a pollinator-friendly community. Boulder resolved to ban the use of neonicotinoids on city property. Neonicotinoids is a systematic, persistent neurotoxin it's a pesticide. So here in Ann Arbor, we're already doing several things. We know that the city's natural area preservation program does not use neonicotinoids on public land. We know that already. We have a grassroots Bee Safe Neighborhood program. We have been designated a Bee City USA community. We have signed on to the mayor's Monarch Pledge already. And so as a committee, we are bringing together all the pollinator stakeholders and planning an overall marketing plan to inform the community about pollinator-friendly practices. And we're developing resources through mailing, news outlets, and of course, we're going to direct people to a website housed at the the National Area Preservation website as a host so far.
Good job.
One other quickie, I would say, on Planning Commission, where things are getting pretty close in terms of approving the reorganization of our ordinances. And the goal in this round is not to change the content, but to really think about it in terms of form. However, because there has been a change in form, things have been clarified. Therefore, the natural features section is actually kind of different than it is right now. So I would just encourage, people to be, if they're curious about that, to be able to read that. It's all available on the city's website. Nothing's been approved, but it's getting close. So.
Anything from PAC? No? Anything from City Council?
You've heard it all.
All right.
Maybe very briefly from Energy. Energy Commission endured the same thing you did tonight, as I mentioned. And the other things that we're working on is what will be a replacement for the Ann Arbor Solar Club residential solar program going forward this year. The vendor that we were working with last year went bankrupt. And so we're looking for a replacement for that. And we're also going to have a number of groups working on different projects, ordinances, updating some of the targets related to the climate action plan and things like that. But the main focus was the metric stuff too.
Can we have a quick update from staff?
Sure. I mean, I think the key thing that is coming up is this reorg potentially. So Nate Geisler and I, the energy person, would go back to the administrator's office. For you, those of you that haven't been around 16 years, that's exactly where I started. And then with the 2 new positions that have been approved, I'm waiting for a meeting to get set up with HR and Crescent, because this is still located in systems planning right now, that official. So I don't know exactly when the transition's going to happen. So that is all good news. Trying to think of other things going on. I'm drawing a blank as to big things. We still are in court with the Gelman situation. I've been spending a fair amount of time on the Part 115, the solid waste reg rewrite. The key issues are making sure that our kind of awesome compost facility isn't over-regulated as they start to regulate compost facilities, and I think that we're going to land okay on that. The other big thing we're working on is private firms are able to use a financial assurance test for the state to say, well, we make this much money, so we don't have to have $1 million bonds here and there for X, Y, and Z. There's not one of these that works well. There's not one for local governments, even though we're less likely to go bankrupt. So there's a few situations like solid waste where there's quite a large revenue, there's a fund balance, but I'm still required to post $1 million bonds to reassure the state that the landfill is going to get managed if we walked away from it, which again is pretty unlikely. So those are kind of the key things. And I apologize for not having better notes for what's going on.
Well, it's okay. We ran longer than we normally do. I know we have on the items for next agenda that we have the Recycling 101 session. We have the Sustainability Forum. And I think that you and I should just talk about whether it makes sense to have the STAR presentation in February. If we have a big solid waste presentation, it may be too much for us to handle in one meeting.
Well, in your Recycling 101, are you getting a new solid waste presentation at the February meeting?
I think
My understanding, yeah, I don't think that the February Recycling 101 is another solid waste presentation, but I do want.
Those are 2 different meetings anyhow, on 2 different days.
Oh,
And
okay.
the administrator confirmed to me that he would provide, whether he's here or someone else, but they would be present for the February meeting.
Yeah, so pushing back STAR, I'll send a link to everyone just so you can kind of peruse it and get a sense. And we're going to be Emily's going to be getting some really detailed kind of crosstabs on the work that we did that was not accessible until we paid our $1,000. So now we should have a better story to tell.
Great. Our next scheduled meeting is February 22nd. Last call for public comment.
Since I'm here, I'm going to add one more little comment about the water issue. I thought they did a good presentation about some ideas about helping single-family owners in meeting their affordability of living in their spots. But, you know, there's going to be in terms of rental properties, I didn't think much was offered. Now, we're talking a huge change in what rental property owners are going to have to pay. Their commodity rate is going from $343 to $213 a unit, 35%. In addition, they're going to have a less cost for their fixed cost in terms of their pipe going in. And in a tight rental environment, that it becomes very questionable in my mind how these savings to the owners of these buildings and the developers are going to be passed along to the renters. And so that's a challenge there as to what you can come up with. Secondly is the conservation aspect of using water. You know, Ann Arbor's reduced its water use substantially over the past 12 or 14 years since we went to the tier program. And partly it's the rates and partly it's the better appliances. But the question becomes, how are we going to encourage conservation in our rental units when we are lowering their cost? Will they still say, well, I'm going to buy a more efficient appliance when my cost has gone down so much and maybe I don't own this building that much longer? And so that's the challenge ahead, is partly also the conservation aspect of these changes in the water rates. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great input. By the way, David's invested a lot of time on this, so he deserves kudos.
As a university dormitory, a multifamily unit.
Okay, if there's no further business to come before the commission, this meeting will now adjourn at 9:31. Thank you, everybody.
10:30 tomorrow?